Hey, everybody, it's Thursday. Welcome to the show. We are Beyond Stocks. My name is Chihiro Kurokawa.
And my name is Pedro De Leon. So happy Thursday. Thank you so much for you guys to give us some great feedback. The show is growing. The team is growing. So I'm excited. And so we're just two guys, looking to understand more about alternative investments. Now, here's one thing I want to say that people have been asking what's alts, right? So anything that has to do with outside of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. And today we're going to be talking about real estate, but specifically real estate development. So today we have an awesome guest. I worked with him in the past. They have some great projects, and I'm excited to have him on the show. So his name is James Ellis. James, thank you for joining us. Looking forward to learn more about you and you educating us more about development. So thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. I've been waiting a long time to get on here. So thank you for finally making that happen for me. I was asking myself this morning if I should get some headphones up, so I can look
Hey, it helps, right? It helps.
No, it probably does too, because hard hearing at my age. That's cool. On my background, Pedro, my background a little bit. I'm an engineer out of University of Texas. Spent the first 20 years of my career engineering projects, design, overseeing of the construction. About 25 years ago, I added building as well as engineering. So started building some of the projects that I was engineering on and building projects for other people. And then 5 years ago, in the middle of COVID, I had this bright idea to become a developer after, 40 years in the business, or I think at 36 at that time. And so here we are floundering 5 years later, trying to make our way in the development world, as well as still trying to build things. So, it's been quite a journey. I was a guy that worked my way through college, so I was a long-term student. Took me about 9 years to get my first degree, so it's been a whirlwind. I've seen a lot of changes in today's world, and happy to try and build a few projects for the next.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about, your experience as far as developing. What kind of projects have you done in the past, so audience can know more about you?
Yeah, the first projects that I signed up were a mobile home entitlement. We bought 50 acres of property and putting it into entitlement. Flipped a couple of houses, as a lot of people do when they're just wanting to make some capital. Another is a VRBO, 12-unit VRBO cabin project that we built, and it came online a little earlier this year. Put my own money into it at the beginning because I thought that was the smart idea. And then last year figured out that wasn't the smartest idea, and we started trying to raise capital. Hence how you and I actually ended up meeting. And we are breaking ground at the beginning of next month on a 53-unit townhouse project in Fort Worth, which is our first project where we will actually have investors involved in that project.
Nice.
And then we're buying a 301 door man camp in Midland, which we actually ended up not needing any investors on that one. And then we're now seeking out more opportunities. We've got an opportunity in Benbrook for a ground up. We've got a couple of mobile home park opportunities that are coming up, and we are actively now raising capital for those projects, which is totally new thing for me. Never had to ask for money before, and it's a whole different concept. And as you are probably aware, anytime you start raising capital, the first thing that everybody tells you is, "Oh, ask your family and friends." And I tell everybody, I don't know about your family and friends, but they borrow money from me. So, it wasn't possible for me to do that. But what I have learned is a lot more goes into this than just, paying for earnest money deposits and, paying architects, engineers, and those kind of things. There's a lot more money that I think that the LPs should take a look at when we're looking at developers is try and get an idea of how much money, or not how much money, but how much effort and investment has gone into what it takes to get to a point where they can even start raising capital for a project.
Right.
I've heard many times and read on LinkedIn many times about, well, if this guy's not investing beside me, I'm not going to invest with him because he's only putting up this much and he's asking me to put up this much. And I think sometimes what they don't get is that the money that we spend just reviewing 20 or 30 projects a month to pick out the 2 or 3 that we're going to try and move forward on. I've got people on my staff who's here to review projects and here to underwrite and here to look at projects and say, okay, these are viable, these are not viable. I've got an entire, I've got a marketing person that I pay that they got to decide whether or not we can even market that project and get into it. And these are salaries and benefits and the cost of our office and the cost of insurance and the cost of all these things that we are spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars just to get to a point where we say, okay, we're picking on a project and we're going to need to raise this much capital.
It kind of brings up big trends that I've been seeing throughout the years. There was at one point when people were saying like, we want to become developers, right? And so as a GP, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And especially, and so if you don't have that experience, definitely you're gonna fail, right? So because you got to manage, like you mentioned, right? Have a marketing team, and even a financials like a CFO or someone, right? So everything, and the one thing that I do want to kind of learn more from you is when you're as a developer, like what are some of the things you look at on the land, the actual materials, like what's something that you can kind of tell us a little bit more so we can feel comfortable saying, hey, this developer knows his stuff, right?
I tend to work backwards. So
okay.
What I look at is, I'll give you, for instance, I'm looking at a blank piece of property, an empty lot in Bentonville. All right. It is not in a class A high end, like our townhouses in Fort Worth, class A top end. You've been to the properties yourself, Pedro. This is high dollar, this is high end stuff. This one is not so much. So what I have to do is I go and I drive around the local area and I look at where it's at. So then, of course, I'm researching through CoStar, Zillow, whatever, as to what the numbers are in those existing units of what I would need to put on that property. And this is based on the fact that the property is already zoned for what I would want to build on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would then look at, okay, here's that number. And I know that I have an estimated number from our past projects and from projects that we've reviewed and all of this as to what price per square foot it's going to cost me to build that project, right? So now I know I have that cost. Well, then that backs into, okay, here's what my soft costs are going to be because I'm going to have to pay this much for the land. I'm going to have to pay this much for the build. I'm going to have this much in soft cost. Now, after I add all of that up and go through it, can I, after the build is done, refinance it and hold on to it? Is that a feasible? Can I finance out into agency financing? And is that feasible? Or do I need to sell it? Our Fort Worth project, we ended up having to build on a sell model versus a rental model because the sales per square foot was better than the rental per foot. So We elected to sell these things. So then you have to look at, okay, well, we're going to model that so that we can sell it while we build it, all of these kind of things. So I actually, and I don't know that it's how every developer does it, because, I self-taught myself after spending, 36 years as the engineer and the builder for developers. And listening to them and working with them and getting projects off the ground, into it actually being, my money that's being done. So that's just my process of how I do it, is I start out, what can I get at the end for it, and work my way backwards and see if it's a reasonable profit for everybody, including the investors. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, the investors are not as worried about the product as much as they're worried about, where's my return, how do I get it, and that kind of stuff. They worry about the product based on what they know a product will work. If you tell them you're going to buy this piece of property and you're going to go build a small amusement park, they might go, I don't know if that's really going to work, But if you tell them that you're building these townhouses in an area that already has townhouses, or you're building small apartments in an area that already has it, they know that's a proven model. And so they're, and there's LPs that say, here's my buy box. I'm going to buy as long as I can make this much in preferred numbers, and I can make this much. So you have to factor all of that in before you say, okay, this is a project I can go forward on. And we literally do right now. We're reviewing. We're trying to get up to 20, but we're reviewing right now between 12 and 15 projects, and I've chosen 2 out of those projects in the last 35 days, 40 days, something like that. But like I said, the biggest thing that, if there was an advice that I would give that some LPs haven't really heard before, is look beyond how much capital the LP or the GP is bringing to the table. It's obviously you want somebody that's got skin in the game. I get that. But also look at what are they doing behind the scenes that's going to make that project successful. Do they have a team that's working on it, or are they a one-man shop? There's a lot of GP guys that they inherit $1 million and all of a sudden they're GPs, but they have no team, they have no overhead, they have no other costs. And so maybe they can put a couple of extra dollars into it, but is that going to make that project successful? Our plan in Fort Worth is to have those things sold by the time we actually finish construction.
Yeah, definitely. So here's a question that was put on here. And it says, what are some of the red flags you look when you're visiting land? Yeah, so as you know.
Utilities.
Okay.
Making sure that there's the proper utilities to the it's there. Our project in San Antonio, for instance, our mobile home park had city water, but did not have city sanitation. All right. So we got to look at, are we doing septics? Are we going to have to go through, on that particular project, we would have to, in order to connect to the water system, we'd have to go almost 2 miles and 14 landowners that we'd have to get easements from in order to run the line. One of those landowners is Texas. Wow. So that's a big thing to look at. Look at if this site is a major hill. Okay, and we had one in Austin that was that way. And from the front of the site to the back of the site, there was an 80-foot rise in the site. Now your building's going to go about halfway up, but now you got big costs because you're going to have to haul about half that material off site. Mm-hmm. All right. So you need to be able to look at that and tell, is that something that I'm going to do? Also, look at your surrounding. What's directly next door to you? I looked at a property for a client the other day, and their next door neighbor is a car wash. Now you may say, "Oh, great, it's a car wash," but they are putting chemicals into into the ground, and sometimes if they're not keeping it clean like they're supposed to, then that can affect your property, right? And because you could one day have a contaminated property that you all of a sudden become responsible to everybody else around you. Okay, now that's a pretty far-fetched one, but it's actually a real life situation I got into with a client recently. So, there's those red flags. Obviously, when you do your research, any past liens or anything like that. One of the things I do that's a little bit different than some people do is I don't really care what the previous person paid that property for. I care about what they're trying to sell it to me for. Because a lot of people will get into, oh, well, you only paid $100,000. You're trying to sell it for $700,000. And I don't like that. You're making too much money. Well, it's not my business how much money they make. I know what I can pay for that property. If they can make $500,000 on that property, God love them. I wish I could do that, but those are most of the red flags: is site elevation, site grading, and how your utilities are to the property. Also, if you're on a major highway, make sure it's not TxDOT. Make sure TxDOT doesn't own it, because then your curb cuts are going to be near impossible to get. So you get to your own property.
Right. So it kind of, so talking about environmental issues. A long time ago, I read an article in California. There was a community where the properties were placed on top where they used to just throw trash from the trash company waste, and they put soil on top of it or whatever. But there's been issues, long run. That is I was like that. How can that even pass?
Well, okay, that's settlement. What happens is that garbage over years degrades. As it degrades, and the weight of the soil that's above it and everything that's on top of that consolidates. In the town I'm from, Grand Prairie, the north side of Grand Prairie, which when I was in high school was the rich part of town. It was built on a landfill from the 1920s, and there was a house over there that actually sank 3 feet. It was a big thing. People used to drive by this expensive house that was sitting like this.
Wow.
There is one years and years ago, my firm was one of the big engineering firms for Home Depot, and they had a property that was built on top of an old landfill that they didn't catch in West Virginia, and one whole tilt panel completely, the foundation moved, and this entire tilt panel moved over, and they had to shut that store down, and they were losing $1 million a week because they had to shut that store down. Wow. So when you look at one of the things, that's one of the reasons why banks require phase ones. Our engineering firm, we do phase ones, and that's that property that I was talking about that was next door to a car wash. I was actually doing a phase one for a client, and that's what those things are supposed to catch, because you research that property back a minimum of 50 years to make sure that doesn't happen. So what occurs a lot of times is you get some people will say, I don't need a phase one. I don't need to pay for that. That's just $3,000 or $4,000, for no reason. Well, there's actually a reason, because we look at a lot of things that might not, be seen. So another recommendation I would have LPs ask their GP about is, have you done an environmental? Is there a full report done? Because that's disastrous. That's like poltergeist disastrous,
Hey, James, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the phase one environmental study, can you explain why that's required and what it does?
Yeah, it's for what's called an innocent landowner defense. So anytime you buy a property, you become liable for that property. And if that property someday contaminates your neighbors or causes an issue on your own site, you are responsible for it. Now, a phase one is a report that's done by engineering firms like mine that does this research on the property. And we go back, like I said, a minimum of 50 years. We study aerial photographs of the site. We do address searches. We run reports that list every underground storage tank within a quarter of a mile radius, half a mile radius. You get reports as to whether there's ever been any kind of leakage in any of those, whether there's ever been what's called a RAP, which is a remedial action plan on those. And then that consultant like us makes a determination that whether or not you need to move forward with a phase two, okay, which is where you actually do invasive testing. You drill and sample the soils and you test it. If there's buildings on site, if it was built before 1978, is there asbestos in the property? And if your consultant gives you and says, everything, there's really no need. Let's face it, if you're building out in the middle of a cow farm, it's very, very, unless they had underground tanks on that site for their tractors, it's very reasonable. It's going to say everything's fine. Don't worry about it. And probably about 80% of the reports are written says that it's fine. It's okay. What it does is, should there ever happen to be a contamination, then you can claim what's called an innocent landowner defense. And that means I did my research and it showed nothing. It's to limit the liability of the landowners. And you generally, if you're financing a property, the bank, whoever your lender is going to require a phase one as part of your due diligence, just like a survey. They're going to require that. So that brings up another good point, is when these LPs are looking at GPs, and I said, look at what they've spent and what they've done to research the property and how are they going to promote the property. Look at their team. We are fortunate that we are a fully integrated developer. We have the development, we have the building, we have our own GC firm, and we have our own in-house engineering firm. And so we are fully integrated. So our team, we can do all of that research once. Now, most developers, 99.9% of the developers, are not fully integrated. They're developers. Their expertise is in the financing of the land, is in buying the project and working out the numbers to make it go forward. And then they hire architects, engineers, and all that.
Right.
So if you're talking to a developer who is not fully integrated like us, look at what, who is he partnering with? Who has he done this research? Does he have a plan? Does he have an idea? If you've got somebody that's buying a raw piece of land, they said, I'm going to build a multifamily on it, and they haven't even hired an architect to do some conceptual drawings yet on it, he's not ready for your investment. So if that's another water caution for your LPs.
Yeah. So, so for you guys that are watching this, working with a developer, because I'm sure if you're in a DFW or places that are growing, cities that are growing, there's a lot of developers out there, and you got a great point there. Make sure who's the teams, who they're working with, how much experience they've been, have as far as developing, because it's really important to know, who you're going to cut your check to, because you want to have somebody that is definitely going to make sure that they know what they're doing, and in the near future, you're going to get those good returns, right? So, and as I see that, I'm sure we are just touching the tip of the iceberg right now when it comes to what to ask or what to know more about a GP when it comes to development. So we can be here forever.
Well, no, I realize that, and we've got a short period of time to get it in. The main point I wanted to say is make sure that they understand the build process, even if they aren't the ones building every major chain that is building their own stores, or is growing, any major chain, they always have in-house construction people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not building it themselves. They're overseeing somebody else building it. I cannot stress enough to have somebody on your team who is the construction person that understands the time frames, understands the nuances. The last thing you want to do is always take the low bid and then spend half your time signing change orders because they left everything out of the bid. If you have somebody on your team who understands that process, they can eliminate or keep to a minimum the change orders that are going to come through on a project that just does nothing but screws up a development budget.
Right.
And so, but again, the main point I wanted to get out this morning is for LPs to not so much thinking, well, this guy's only bringing $500,000 to the table and he's trying to raise $6 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got to understand there's so much more that has been spent than that. My Fort Worth project, it would not shock me if I had not spent on money that won't even get counted towards the equity, well over $150,000.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've done, the time, the payroll, insurance, everything, And I think that's something that needs to be looked at closer than always saying, oh, well, he's only bringing $500,000. It's not enough, But that's the way LPs have been taught,
Hey, James, when something's being built, what's the difference between what an architect does and what the engineer does? I've never understood that.
Okay, well, the architect is the overall manager of the entire project as far as, it's his concept, it's his drawings, it's his set. The engineer designs to his build, but what the architect is not responsible for the structural components of the project. In other words, he draws conceptual drawings, but the engineer is the one who does all the calculations and he actually designs the structure. So I always say the architect gets to be the pretty guy and the engineer has to be the ugly guy because we're basically designing the bones and he gets to design the facial features. So
then does that mean that potentially once the engineer has gotten involved, that heights and lengths and thicknesses and materials may change?
They could change, but generally the architect will spec things out and the engineer will design to that specification.
Okay.
So, but sometimes they say, let's, and I know we're running out of time, but let's say the architect thinks that he's building a multi-story building and he thinks the columns on the inside when he's doing his interior design are only going to be 2x2s. And the engineer says, no, they have to be 4x4s, which takes away a lot of space. But that's kind of rare. Usually the engineers are involved so early that that's handled beforehand.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. So we are coming to a close, James. So what is the best way for someone who wants to work with you, want to learn more about the development side, how they can connect with you?
Okay, you can, the best way for the development part of our company is to reach out to Leah, which is, her email is LIA@Arundel, ARUNDEL, GROUP, LLC.com. And if it's anything having to do with, if you need somebody who can do construction, site work, utilities, and all that, you reach out to James at the same thing, Arundel Group, LLC.com.
Okay.
And it's pretty simple. We're pretty easy to talk to.
Yeah, and I do know that Leah made a playbook, questions that LPs might have as far as working with an developer. So
yeah, she did do that actually.
Yes.
And I read it after she did it. It actually was really good. I was very proud. I was like, wow, I couldn't have wrote that.
Yeah.
So she's head of our development, and so she's the person to talk to for that.
Awesome. Well, James, thank you so much for chiming in and giving us some of the construction knowledge. And for you guys that want to know more about it, definitely reach out to James or Leah. And thank you so much again for following us, spreading the word, and looking forward to you guys meeting on our May 29th event Thursday in McKinney. So stay tuned. Until next time, take care, guys.